Formula One has a tyre issue, and instead of F1 messing about with the weekend format and sprints, they need to look a little bit closer to home, and I think one of the biggest issues is the tyres, and it's not Pirelli's fault. Let me explain. Before we discuss the issue, we probably need to explain what the problem is, or at least what I think the problem is. Let's take the last race at Miami as a prime example. Lewis Hamilton ran his hard tyres at a competitive pace, for the Mercedes at least, for 38 laps of a 57-lap race. That's roughly 67% of the total race distance, which is a lot. But Max Verstappen, on the other hand, stopped on lap 45, which is 79% of the race distance. Almost 80% of that race ran on one tyre since the start, when fuel was the heaviest, and more importantly, Max was still putting in quick and competitive laps. If we then look back only a week earlier to Baku, we see more of the same. Esteban Ocon pitted on the final lap of the race. 51 laps of the Baku circuit, and he started on the hards and did the entire race distance. Now, I'm not saying that the Ocon strategy was the prime strategy, but I don't think there's any situation where you should be able to run one set of tyres for the entirety of a race. If you can run one set of hard tyres or medium tyres for the length of a race and still be reasonably competitive with your times, I think there's a fundamental issue. It's important to note though that the hard tyres are not the same across all races. It can be a separate compound despite being called the hard tyre. I've done a video explaining all the tyres in Formula 1, which I will link below if you want to check it out in more detail, but here's the lowdown. Pirelli has a choice of 6 tyre compounds they can choose from, C0 all the way to C5. C0 is the hardest tyre and C5 is the softest tyre. They pick 3 of these compounds to bring to a race weekend based on the characteristics of the circuit, how abrasive it is, and a number of other factors such as temperature. This means that one weekend may have the C0, which is the hardest available, and then the C1 and the C2, and then they all fit into hard, medium, and soft. Whereas another weekend may have the C3 as the hard tyre. Then the C4 and the C5 would be the medium and the soft. And in that situation, C3 and C0 would both be labelled the hard tyre, but they'd be very different compounds. Miami had the C4, C3 and C2, which is only one step away from being the softest available, which was the choice at Baku. So these tyres weren't even the hardest available in the Pirelli range. To understand the problem, we need to understand how we got here. Now, Pirelli have been the sole tyre manufacturer in Formula 1 now since 2011, but before that, it was Bridgestone. And before that, it was Bridgestone and Michelin. That's right, we used to have 2 tyre manufacturers in Formula 1, and teams would choose which manufacturer they wanted to supply their tyres. But this, well, it was a crazy idea, because what it meant was certain teams were advantaged or disadvantaged on a Grand Prix weekend based on the manufacturer they went with. Because some weekends Michelin would be better and others Bridgestone would be better based on the track. It was a crazy idea. And in 2025, we might very well get a new tyre manufacturer because the tender for the Formula 1 tyres is up and Pirelli's contract ends in 2024. We should also probably say, in fairness, any stick related to the tyres is aimed at Pirelli, but it's not entirely their fault. They build tyres specifically to the specifications that Formula 1 request. So the issue doesn't really lie with Pirelli, but more F1 management. Pirelli just make what F1 tell them to make. Also, in fairness to Pirelli, the new tyres are a little bit less sensitive compared to 2021, when you really needed to nurse the tyres up to temperature or risk taking the best life out of them very early on. The medium and hard tyres that Pirelli bring to races now can be used to push hard, which is what we want, right? The problem is that the base strategy for most races now is medium hard if you've got good track position, and start and run long on the hards if you're further back on the grid. Very few drivers opt for the soft tyres because they simply don't last long enough, and there's not enough delta between the soft and the mediums in a race to make the degradation worthwhile, or certainly to make an extra stop worthwhile. Most races now are a one-stop in normal circumstances, and being able to run one tyre the length of an entire race isn't exactly good either. There has to be a balance. We want tyres that allow drivers to push, and we want to see drivers pushing to the maximum. But we already know that in most situations, drivers are trying to save tyres very early on in a race so that they can make one stop work. Drivers are managing battery, tyres, fuel, and whatever other issues they may have almost from lap 1. It's just that it's not visible on the TV unless you're listening to the team radio. I saw a suggestion from Karun Chandak that said Formula 1 should force the drivers to use all 3 compounds during a race: soft, medium, and hard. Now, the first thing this would guarantee is that there would be at least 2 stops. During a dry race, drivers would have to run the soft, medium, and hard and choose when to run them. Do you run the soft at the beginning of a race to gain an advantage and maybe try and pull away, or do you use the soft at the end of the race when you're on lower fuel? I like the idea of this concept, but I still think that teams will come to the same conclusions on when to run these tyres, and perhaps it won't change that much. In the interest of spicing up stints and making drivers push a little bit more and making it a little bit more tactical, I actually think Formula 1 should follow in the footsteps of IndyCar and push to pass. During the F1 refueling era, strategies were vastly different because cars started the race with different fuel loads. F1 will never bring that back, sadly, due to safety and costs, but other series around the world do make it work, such as IndyCar. And I think there is something else we can learn from IndyCar: push to pass. Introduced all the way back in 2009, push to pass is activated after 2 green laps, just like DRS in Formula 1. Push to pass, though, gives the drivers roughly 60 extra horsepower while they are using that button, but they only have a limited amount available. The amount is determined before a race, and it's slightly different each track, but it's usually between 150 and 200 seconds. It can be used in 20-second bursts, but a driver needs to decide when to use it. Use it to defend, use it to attack, try and save it for later in the race, use it early on for track position. It's a very tactical decision, with sometimes racings being made or lost on management of push to pass. Now, I appreciate that push to pass isn't a solution necessarily for tyres. They're 2 very separate things. But having a system like push to pass might mean that drivers are more willing to make a 2-stop work, knowing that they've got the opportunities to get past other cars. And when they're out on track, then perhaps more willing to push. Like I said before, there is a fine balance with F1 tyres. We want tyres the drivers can push with, but they can't last too long, but they can't wear too quickly. And I appreciate there isn't a definitive answer. We don't want drivers pitting every 10 laps either, but I don't see how doing an entire race distance on one set of tyres is good for the sport. I think it needs to change. I don't know what the solution is, and some people might even say there's no problem. But to me, the idea of doing an entire race distance on one set of tyres comfortably, it just doesn't sit well with me. It just doesn't make sense. I think adding something like push to pass might not cure this problem with the tyres, but I do like it as a concept in Formula 1 nonetheless. I would like to see Formula 1 tyres not last as long, just to put it on the edge of that 1-stop and 2-stop more regularly. And I appreciate that there's a fine balance. We don't want tyres to go off too early so that drivers are pitting all the time. We don't want them to last too long. And I appreciate there's never that perfect in the middle. But doing 51 laps as Ocon did in Baku, and 45 laps as Max Verstappen did in Miami, it doesn't make a whole host of sense to me, and I do think there needs to be a change. Let me know what you think below, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.